What a great joy and delight it is to be together with you this afternoon and have an opportunity to once again move back into a world of human contact. These past months have been extraordinarily demanding for many, many people, and the ongoing dream for me was to be able to do in-person events like the one we're about to share this afternoon. As is my wont, I usually like to share the wisdom of Brother Thomas as a way to frame the conversation. He wrote, "Artists are the discoverers and the custodians of the unlooked for. They see beyond, yet they stay the course." And having read Asako's book some months ago, I really felt that I had come across an artist who had done exactly that, had enabled us to understand a life and a history that was ours, meaning universally, and at the same time had enabled us to investigate it and in a sense to allow us to better understand and engage with the human condition. Thomas also wrote, "We all share a creative goal with art. The goal is difficult. It is an invitation to change the world." And again, reading the book and realizing what the book is about, certainly for me and I hope for others who will read it, it really is about us remaining committed to using art as a vehicle to really change the world for the better. Thomas also wrote, "Art is an intuitive statement about humanity. Otherwise, nature would have been enough." And what an opportunity to gather at this moment, in a sense, to reaffirm our commitment to life, to ideas, to sharing, to creativity. And the final quote I would like to share is one that I hope will inform the conversation. Thomas wrote, "Memory is more permanent than matter." And it seems to me a profound way to move into the Inheritors, actually Inheritors without the "the," and welcome you, both Susan and Asako, to share with us a journey into your book and into your world. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Bernie, for having me here. And thank you, Susan, for being here with me too. And thank you to the Japan Society. I mean, this is just an honor, and it's really special to be able to read and share my work in this space with all of these beautiful art and history as well. So thank you. So I think I'll talk a little bit about the book, which is basically a hybrid book. It's a collection of interconnected stories that span about 100 years or more than that. And it traces 5 generations of a Japanese family that's fractured and scattered across Asia and the US by this Pacific side of the Second World War, or Asia-Pacific War. And it's kind of a mosaic of different perspectives and different styles and forms. And I think I'll start by reading from a couple of different stories, and I'll start by reading from a story called Willow Run, and there's going to be a short accompanying video. It's a public domain footage of 1930s and 1940s Tokyo, and there are segments that's going to show the aftermath of the American firebombing of Tokyo, but there's nothing gruesome. I think the only thing that you might know is that the story is told as a one-sided interview where you see or hear the, well, you don't see or hear the interviewer's questions, but you hear or see the answers, the narrator's answers. And the narrator is an old Japanese woman who has come to talk about her wartime experiences with these American historians who are soliciting testimonies for legal justice. The story is set in 1991, which is 46 years after the Second World War and a couple of years after the Showa emperor's death. And the Showa emperor is the emperor who presided over the mid-20th century wars. Okay. So, Willow Run. Do you know Willow Run? Yes, willow as in the tree, run as in the verb. Of course, I had no idea what it meant then, or what he, the soldier, meant by it. But I liked the sound, Willow Run, like something wispy, something escaping. Looking back, I have to laugh. But at the time, I'd repeat the words so cumbersome on my tongue. Many women recited the sutras, but in that situation, I'm sorry, was there some way you wanted me to begin? I was born in the first year of Taisho. That's right, 1912. Of course, as a Japanese, I wonder if nuances aren't lost when accounting in the Western way. For example, unlike Meiji people, like our parents, we Taisho people were very open to the Western world. Have you heard of moga, or modangaru? As a girl, I thought we were quite modern, quite the sophisticates. I'll be 79 in October. Yes, my husband passed on last year, which is why I decided to come. But please, as I mentioned on the telephone, my son, he's a scholar. I don't want him implicated. You explain very well your legal ambitions, but are you sure my name won't? No, I'm prepared to talk. It's just that, well, if I had half your courage, a young woman like yourself, coming all this way from America. You mentioned your parents are Korean? Then I can understand your interest. But is your cameraman a historian too? Why an American man would be interested in? But I'm sorry, it must be my nerves chatting away like this. Not that people don't come forward. Someone always comes forward, don't they? And now with our Showa emperor passed, and everybody reflecting on that war. You see, your call for testimonies, it was the first time I saw anybody soliciting that story. Oh dear, the hand towel. No, it's all right. It's the camera still. At the time of surrender, my husband and I were already in O City. We'd fled Tokyo after we lost our son. Oh no, we only had one biological child. After the war, we adopted our son. Yes, the scholar, though we didn't tell him that about his adoption. After all, our child, he was 15, why he wasn't in the room that night. Yes, the March air raid. Looking back, I see how unprepared we were. We'd gotten used to the false alarms. All we'd seen was the glow of distant flashes. But that night, we hardly had a minute before we heard the whistling. Back then, we slept in our clothes, so all we had to do was grab our emergency bags and put on our silly hoods. Oh, they were just padded pieces of cloth, another thing our government cooked up. Still, we put them on, you know, half of us running around with our hoods on fire. We ran and ran, our houses shooting into flames. Until then, I never knew fire could be so loud, crashing about like that. And the heat, it was like a rubber mask. We couldn't breathe or see. All we could do was run from street corner to street corner, smoke rolling in from every side, shadows appearing and disappearing, sometimes knocked away like bowling pins. Everywhere, families were calling each other. And one mother, I'll never forget her, came barging past with a baby strapped to her back. She was so determined, you know. But that poor baby, its little head was knocked back and running like an egg. There were so many lost children. We tried to take them with us, but they clung to the spots where they thought their parents would come back for them. We eventually found a shelter, but the next morning, everything was in piles. Even the air was scorched, embers floating like fireflies. And the bodies, you know, they were sprawled every which way, clogging the ditches, cluttering the streets. And all I could think was whether Seiji, our son, had taken his emergency bag, or whether I'd seen it at the entrance. Now there's little to remind us of that time, but it's the body that remembers. Some people can't stand the sound of fireworks. For myself, it's the smell of roasting meat. So I'll stop there, but story goes on like this, and you start to see why this woman is telling her story and what's at stake, not just for her, but also for the interviewer, as the space of the testimony sort of becomes this battleground. And the two women are kind of locked in a power struggle, with both of them trying to control or shape the narrative that's being given. So that was Willow Run. And then for the second one, I'm going to read from Train to Harbin. This one is written in a kind of elliptical memory structure where the narrator's consciousness sort of circles around the spoke of a memory that this person is wary of remembering, but is tethered to and keeps sort of returning to it in this compulsive kind of way. And I'm going to read from parts of the beginning, which I've sort of streamlined and stitched together, but hopefully you'll get a sense of it. The only thing you might know is that the first person narrator, is a Japanese research doctor who was specially sort of deployed to China by the Japanese military during the Second World War. Okay, so Train to Harbin. I once met a man on the train to Harbin. He was my age, just past his prime, hair starting to grease and thin in a way one might have thought passably distinguished in another context, in another era, where he might have settled, reconciled to finishing out his long career predictably. But it was 1939. War had officially broken out between China and Japan, and like all of us on that train, he too had chosen to take the bait, that one last bite, before acquiescing to life's steady decline. You see, for us university doctors, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We all knew it, especially back then. 2 nights and 3 days from Wonsan to Harbin, the train clattered on, the lush greenery interrupted by trucks and depots manned by soldiers in military khaki. Despite the inspections and unexplained transfers, this man, I shall call S, remained impassive, shadowed by a dusky light that had nothing to do with the time of day or the dimness of the car's interior. He sat leaning against the window pane, face set, impervious to the din around him. Later, I would come to recognize this posture of self-recrimination, but at the time, I had barely recovered from my initial journey from Niigata to Wonsan, across the Sea of Japan, and I was in a contemplative mood myself, in no condition to pause over the state of others, much less engage with my colleagues, who by now had begun drinking in earnest, liquor still being plentiful then, oiling even the most reticent of tongues. So I excused myself and must have promptly nodded off. For the next moment, it was dawn, the day just beginning to break, the length of the train still shrouded in sleep. I was the only one awake, the only one woken by the sudden cessation of rhythm, which drew me to the window, still dark except for my reflection superimposed on it. We had apparently stopped for cargo, the faint scuffling I could hear revealing a truck ringed by soldiers, their outlines camouflaged against the paling horizon. Later, I would learn the significance of this stop, but for the moment, the indistinct scene strained my eyes, and I pulled back, hoping to rest for another hour. 40 years later, this scene returns to me with a crispness that seems almost specious when so much else has faded or disappeared. Perhaps it is simply the mind which, in its inability to accept a fact, returns to it, sharpening the details, resolving the image, searching for an explanation that the mind, with its slippery grasp on causality, will never be able to find. Most days, I'm spared by the habits of routine. But when the air darkens like this, turning the windows inward and truncating the afternoon, the present recedes. If hindsight were less truculent, I might have long ago been granted the famed view of belated clarity that might have illuminated the exact steps that led me into the fog of my actions. But hindsight has not offered me this view. my options and choices as elusive now as they had been then. After all, it was war, an inexcusable logic, but also a fact. We adapted to the reality over which we felt we had no control. 2 hours later, we pulled into Harbin. Our emperors celebrated new acquisition. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. From Harbin, the doctors are taken south to a place called Pingfan, where their research facility is located. And they gradually discover the full scope of their assignment, which involves what they call maruta. Maruta in Japanese means log, like a lumber log. Pingfan from the start was remarkable, its imposing structure looming in calculated isolation, its vast grounds secured by high voltage walls, its 4 corners staked with watchtowers overlooking its 4 gates, armed with guards whose shouts were regularly drowned out by the clatter of surveillance planes circling the facility. Approaching them for the first time in jostling trucks, we watched the walls of the compound unroll endlessly before us, each additional meter contracting our nerves so that our faces, initially loose with excitement, began to tighten, eliciting a lustrous laugh from our young guide, who turned to remark, "Of course, we don't bear the emperor's emblem here." Sure enough, when we stopped for authorization at the gate, we saw that the walls were indeed ungraced. In a world where even our souls were expected to bear the mark of the emperor, the absence was terrifying, and perhaps this was when I saw Pingfan, its forbidding grandeur cloaked by its unmarked walls, presaging what it was capable of. By then, it was clear that the warning emanating from it made no exceptions, even as it opened its gates and saluted us in. All told, I spent 24 months in Pingfan. Officially, we were the Boekikuisubu, the Anti-Epidemic War Sanitation Unit, Unit 731, a defensive research unit. Materially, Pingfan spanned 300 hectares, its fertile land dappled with forests and meadows, its innumerable structures, headquarters, labs, dorms, airfield, greenhouses, pool, luxuriously accommodated within its fold. Locally, we were known as a lumber mill, our pair of industrial chimneys continually emptying into the impending sky. I do not know who came up with the term maruta. Possibly its usage preceded us. The first time we saw them, we were in the hospital ward where they looked like any patients, intubated under clean sheets changed daily. The second time we saw them, it was at the prison ward where they looked like any prisoners, uniformed and wary. Both times, I remember the hush that fell over us as we registered exactly what we were being shown before we were briskly ushered away. By the time we were given full reign over our research, we were using the term, counting up the beds, tallying our maruta, in preparation for our next delivery. Indeed, I believe it was a cargo transfer that I witnessed that morning on the train to Harbin. I was asked to inspect such a cargo just once. Woken abruptly, I was summoned by an officer waiting in an idling jeep. Throughout the ride, I was bleary, my mind cottony with sleep, and once I gleaned the purpose of the trip, a preliminary health scan, I shut out the chatter and arrived unprepared for the secluded station, the small squadron of military guards patrolling the length of the curtained train, the cargo's white tarp peeled back to reveal 12 prisoners strapped to planks and gagged by leather bits. My first reaction was morbid fascination, my mind unable to resolve the image of these people packed like this, and the term maruta acquired a horrific appropriateness that struck a nerve. I began to laugh, a sputtering sound that elicited a disapproving glance from the officer who pressed me forward. How they managed to survive, I could not imagine. Trembling with exhaustion, they lay in their thin prisoner's clothes, wet and stinking of their own unirrigated waste, until one by one they were unfastened, forced to stand, their movements minced by the shackles that still bound their hands and feet. No one protested, the only shouts coming from the guards as they stripped and prodded them, the tips of their knives shredding their garments, exposing them first to the cold, then to the water, as a pair of soldiers hosed them down. Had I been able to, I would have abandoned my post, and perhaps I made as if to do so, for the officer gripped my arm, his placid face nicked by repulsion, though it was unclear for whom or what. As the water dripped away and the maruta were toweled off, I was led to the nearest plank where 4 women, now manacled together, sat shivering. They were all in their 20s and 30s, their eyes black with recrimination, and their chattering bodies so violently pimpled by the cold I could hardly palpate them. The second plank was an all-male group, each man wiry with work, irradiated by humiliation so primal my hands began to shake. The third and final plank was a mixed group, perhaps a family. One woman grew so agitated by my attempts to minister to a limp girl that I barely registered the man pulled from the train and added to the cargo. This new prisoner was my age, in good health, and spirited enough to have risked the curtains to spy from the train window. He was brought to me to be tranquilized, and though I must have complied, I remember nothing else. Only the leering heat of the soldiers snapped to attention behind me, and then later the vague relief that flooded me when the next day I stepped into my ward and did not recognize a single face. Lumber mill? I don't believe anyone was so naive.
Wow. I really am so blown away by just what you read just now, and also having had the chance to read the book and be so impressed by how magnificently you write, and that was very clear in your readings, just the exquisiteness of your prose. Also the way you use voices. I mentioned that to you in an email I wrote when I first read the book, that you have this really amazing ability to create memorable, distinct, individual, compelling voices. And the old lady in the first story you write about has one kind of voice, and then you have the reflective surgeon's voice, a very interesting contrast. But I wanted also just to point out how very powerful these stories are, and how I'm interested in why you chose those two, because it seemed to me that these are, in a certain way, the most, and I mean this in a very good way, the most distressing stories of your whole book. And in both cases, they are stories of really, of horror that is being remembered by 2 very different people and 2 very different experiences. In one case, we have a woman who really has been consistently a victim. In the other case, you have a person who was a professional who more or less probably didn't have much choice in ultimately becoming a doctor who performed experiments on prisoners, but still came from a class where he had some power, some agency, and some ability to decide. So they're 2 very compelling narratives of the horrors of war, but told from very different points of view. And I think one thing I also was struck by in these stories was memory. And these are people who are dealing with incredibly painful memories. And I think we were talking about this earlier before we started this program, about how increasingly we worry that people in the world of 2021 seem to be not wanting to deal with history, not wanting to deal with memories. And I think one of the things I loved about your book is you are forcing not only us, but also your characters into situations where they're confronting very challenging, I mean, challenging is almost a cliche in this case, really painful, excruciating memories, and they are still doing that. They are continuing to do that. And I think that's a very wonderful thing that you do in the book. And it's something that maybe on a larger scale we should be doing in general when we're teaching, when we're talking about events, rather than hide from them because they're so unpleasant. And in some ways you left the most excruciating memories out of your reading, thank you. But again, those of you who heard her just speak, and she did such a beautiful job, you know that you can feel the suspense, the kind of the going back down that trail of the past into something that's like a nightmare that you have to kind of come up against.
Yeah, it was interesting to try to choose something to read, and I think that the juxtaposition of these two felt representative of sort of the position of, I think, Japan in this way, because on the one hand, you know, they're always victims of war, but Japan is also was an imperial power, and so, you know, the perpetrator aspect was also important, and I think to be able to juxtapose these two seemed important to do in terms of, you know, the kinds of histories that we all inherit, you know, and maybe to know about, you know, and to keep that sort of context and that sort of juxtaposition alive. And I think the other thing about these stories is that they're both told from the perspective, the narrators are older people, and, you know, and I think that this has something to do with, for me at least, you know, this idea that sometimes it takes a long time for people to actually come to terms with it and be able to tell the story, you know. And I think that for the woman in Willow Run, for example, I would say that, you know, part of this story that kind of emerged so late in her life, part of it is the Showa Emperor the Showa Emperor's death and the sort of ending of this era that kind of, you know, provoked a reflection. And, you know, this idea that there wasn't space for her to give this kind of, to tell her story, you know, just because partly being a perpetrator nation too, the idea of a victim, you know, where is that sort of place for that sort of story, especially in a patriarchal structure. And so I think that was one of the things about that particular story. And, you know, one of the things that I always wonder about or think about for myself is sort of like, you know, what I want to do with these stories as somebody writing in English in the 21st century. And that's something that sort of is always a challenge to figure out, you know, and how to responsibly sort of access and also tell the stories like this, especially if they're unrepresented or sort of underrepresented, yeah, perspectives. And I think in terms of Train to Harbin, it's the same sort of thing. The challenge there, given the, you know, when you write about perpetrators, it's really hard to, you know, because you don't want to end up justifying or excusing, you know, war crimes. And I think that, you know, it's really hard to sort of write from that perspective, and yet it felt so important to do that because, you know, when we're talking about wars and the trauma of war, it's really the complexities and the little sort of moments, the little complicities, and, you know, it's on the spectrum, so there's little complicities that are also on the same spectrum or continuum as like these larger atrocities, you know, and it felt important to sort of try to articulate that perspective.
I'm interested that you use the word juxtaposition. And I can see why you're saying that, because it's so difficult to deal with Japanese history in the 20th century, because absolutely you have Japan essentially being kind of forced by the imperialist West into a very difficult position, yeah. And then Japan becoming an empire in itself and really oppressing on a very brutal level many other countries too. So how do you tell all these different kinds of entwined stories? And I would say maybe rather than juxtapose, I think what you do so well is that you do interweave these stories together, and you do show the kind of the darkness and the light and a kind of tapestry of responsibility and guilt. And there is, you know, there's a huge amount of guilt, especially in Train to Harbin, which I thought was beautifully done. and also sometimes the fact that what do you do if you're just a child of history, of events? And if I might, I wanted to read my favorite section in your work, because it really encapsulates this. It's from your story, which is maybe the most, perhaps more, again, I hate to use the word challenging, but the story that you call Pavilion, which is partly inspired by this Borges story called The Garden of Forking Paths, which, as you say, is all about a kind of an allegorical representation of time through a garden or a maze-like garden where people keep having to choose which way to go, and they don't necessarily where they're going, but they end up in a certain place, which is what happens to us all. And it's a brilliant story. I thought, now you're having a dialogue with one of the great writers of the 20th century, an Argentinian writer, Borges, who writes this amazing story about it's an Englishman who's a sinologist and a Chinese spy who's working for the Germans. Right. And right there, as you have in the two characters who are talking about it, are saying, yeah, already in this story you have all these international things going on. And again, another side of your work is you span America and Japan and China. And in this story you do bring up this story about an Englishman too, which I really liked. But this feeling that this is a story about a murder, which is perhaps could have been avoided, but perhaps not. And in both cases, and the characters in your story are talking about this. And the question is, in the final kind of moment, do you decide to murder someone? Do you decide to do X or Y? How do you choose that? Or has that already been chosen for you? Or are there many other paths? And I felt like that is really what we're dealing with in history, is that, you're really making this clear that Japan, certain things were not necessarily had to happen, but they did. And we're all inheritors of this. And how do we deal with this inheritance? So I wanted to read the last paragraph in the story Pavilion. And they're talking about the idea of the threshold. And because this moment of kind of liminality where you're kind of betwixt and between, and it's that moment when just before you choose. And we Japanese, for example, have many rituals to acknowledge space, the physical space of a place, the space of a threshold, as well as the shared space of a meeting, the social space born in a moment of an encounter. We mark this space with a bow. I've never given it much thought, except to defy the practice, which I saw as one more subjugating custom of polite society. But since meeting you, I've come to see this as a gesture not of self-abnegating obeisance, but of vital self-negation, as we each pause at the threshold of our common space and lower our heads in deference, so that we might together, even under the eternal augur of a curse, ceaselessly start anew in light. I'd love it if you wanted to comment on that with your own brilliant prose.
Well, I mean, there's so many ways to talk about that particular story. Well, let's see. I think, one of the things about this book, the sort of thread of it, because it starts, where it starts, it's not linear, and then it ends sort of in the future, like the near future. And so it spans all of this time, and I think one of the things about this, and it kind of starts with the epigraph, which is a comment on the Enlightenment Project, the Western Enlightenment Project, where there's this kind of privileging of science and technology and rationality and this kind of notion of progress. And Adorno is a philosopher who sort of talks about this and critiques it and sort of talks about how this became a tool of dominance rather than a tool for human happiness, which was the whole project. And so this particular story, Pavilion, takes that sort of thread and sort of looks at it, like, where did we go wrong? Where did the world go wrong in wrestling with this particular thing? How did this thing that's supposed to bring enlightenment turn into something so dark that it produced something like World War II, with its death camps and also with these other kinds of atrocities. And so, I saw Borges' story as being something that takes this on in a particular way to see if there was a way to twist or turn and choose differently. And that sort of, the location of agency, like individual agency, is one of the things that all my characters probably wrestle with. And so this story is sort of looking at Borges' story and sort of critiquing it in a certain way too, because I think that in that story, the spy ends up killing the sinologist who is trying to reconnect him with his culture and give him this kind of life. And, he has this enormous connection. The two characters have this enormous connection that was almost familial. And yet, despite all of that, the spy ends up killing the sinologist. So to me, I read that story as a failed sort of, a failed understanding of the Enlightenment Project and what happened, because that the spy couldn't choose differently. And so in that moment, in this story, the two characters are talking about this, trying to see if there was some way to maybe avoid this kind of fate. And so in that last paragraph, this is where, one of the characters comes to a conclusion about how we might, going forward, maybe have a chance at not, I don't want to say repeating, but bringing about this kind of world and wars again. And so that moment is kind of like this moment of, okay, how can we do that? And I think it's this moment when you encounter another person, you come to a moment of choice and threshold, and there's a moment at which, like, how can you see another person as a human who is there, and how can we, preserve that space of respect and acknowledgement to avoid that,
I think that's so interesting. I wrote a book about Miyazaki, this Japanese anime director, and he has a moment in his life that he returns to during the bombing, the firebombing. And it's so interesting because reading your description of the firebombing and then his own memories, he was only 4 years old. Mm-hmm. And he had a moment when he was in the car with his family, and they were rich enough to have a car and gas, which was very unusual in 1945. And they're racing through the fiery streets of Tokyo, and Miyazaki remembers this woman with a baby, very much sort of like in your story, except she's holding the baby like this, and she comes up to the car and she says, "Please let us on. Please take us with you." And the parents say, "We just can't. We don't have enough space. We really don't." And Miyazaki ceaselessly goes over this in his mind. And of course, he's 4 years old. There's nothing he can do. Right. But at the same time, he wishes. He says, if only I could have been the child, if such a child were to exist who could have said to his parents, stop the car, you must do this. And it's exactly that forking path. And what's interesting, to give you the happy ending though, is in Miyazaki's movies, he consistently shows us children who do meet the challenges, who are resilient, who do rescue. And so exactly, as you're saying about this threshold moment, and I actually compare Miyazaki, or talk about him in terms of a European philosopher named Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, who was actually, he was Jewish, French Jew, and during the war he actually was put in a POW camp, and he survived. But it wasn't a great experience, but what's so interesting is that Levinas ends up with a philosophy of the other, in which he says you have to look the other in the face. You cannot just deal only with hatred and curses and anger and hostility. You must remember the other and respect the other and try and give love to the other. And I think that's exactly what you're saying in this threshold moment when you have the opportunity, when you're bowing or you're dealing with encountering the other. What do you do? And I think that's really, again, why I found this story so powerful.
Well, thank you. I think, one thing that you had mentioned about this idea of interweaving versus juxtaposition. It's funny that you mentioned that because it's something I thought a lot about, and in the end I decided to write these stories as a collection of interconnected stories that are hybrid rather than a novel. And partly it's because I wanted to preserve the white space between the stories, you know, and this idea that each story is autonomous, you know, and a full perspective. But when you juxtapose it with other stories, you start to see the partiality of that perspective, you know, and that sort of mosaic sort of structure was really important. And the other thing is about the kaleidoscopic element, where these are clustered in different, you know, groupings, like their family structures, but they can also be, they're kind of designed to be clustered in other ways. Like you turn the kaleidoscope and you get a different pattern. And so if you can cluster all the children narratives together, or all the women together, and you can kind of see, you know, women in different times, different contexts, and different proximity to that particular, you know, the war, for example. And so that was one of the things that was important to this.
I love the idea of the kaleidoscope, because exactly, I mean, I went back and reread the book today as I was traveling here. Oh my gosh, I hadn't realized all these resonances, all these connections. And also the idea of negative space. I've been building a Japanese garden, and with, not that I'm a great gardener, but I've been learning about negative space in the Japanese garden, because of course you have to, and there's where you do have juxtaposition and intertwining, because you'll have the negative space of the sand or the earth, and then you'll have a tree, and then you'll have more negative space. It's very different from the kind of thick, luxuriant, everything clustered together of an English garden. But it creates, again, a kind of mosaic that has its own kind of power, precisely because you have absence and presence sort of working within and without each other.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly it. I mean, and you know, going back to this light and darkness that you were talking about too, I mean, there's the interplay between the two, and the idea that you can't have one without the other, or understand one without the other. I mean, you would like to have one without the other, the light without the dark. But so yeah, I mean, I think that all of these things are part of the book in its conception.
Yeah, I think you do a lot with imagery too, and vision, especially in Train to Harbin. This time when you were reading, I suddenly remembered something which I hadn't thought of before. You're talking about the doctor's looking out of the train window, and he sees his reflection,
yes, right?
And I thought, oh my God, this reminds me of Kawabata, the snow Country, which is one of the great novels of 20th century Japan. And in it, you again have, it's a lot about identity and a man who is sort of not wanting to engage with anything beyond a very, very strict, constricted identity, but he can't help himself. He still takes himself away from Tokyo into the snow country, and he looks out the window and he sees not himself, but he sees the reflection of someone else, a woman across from him. And he has this sort of momentary shock, and again this feeling that the windows and mirrors and you talk about how people define their identity, and how sometimes we need the shock of a juxtaposition or of a kaleidoscope to see our identity in a richer, fuller manner.
Yeah, and especially with the Train to Harbin too. You know, this is it's kind of a bifurcated, split sort of consciousness, you know, where somebody's trying to deal with a memory of themselves, or part of themselves that they can't really deal with, or don't want to, or it's very difficult to. And you know, one thing about that is, you know, when I was doing a lot of research about this, I saw a documentary where it was called Japanese Devils, and it was a documentary where the interviewer was interviewing perpetrators, like war criminals, and you know, it was really intense and upsetting to watch, partly because of all of this horrific things that were coming out of their mouths about what they did and everything, but the other part was that, you know, these people were so blank. They were completely blank and stricken. And, you know, I think it's this moment where I realized that, you know, there is trauma here too, you know, and these, there are sociopaths for sure, but I think that there are many people who are really just regular people with families, and they were put in such impossible situations too. And there's this kind of like, they kept saying, I can't believe I did this, and you get the sense that these are people who are kind of stuck in this moment. And yet, and the other thing too is I'm watching this thinking, it's a privilege for me to sit here in my own living room thinking that I would never do that, and so I think that, and society has a way of scapegoating these, men. And also, I think perpetrators don't really have any kind of space in society, which makes sense. But at the same time, I think that scapegoating is, I think problematic and dangerous because, again, like if you scapegoat, you're kind of giving away your responsibility there,
Exactly. It's we can feel better about ourselves by targeting these predators and perpetrators. I wonder if it might be time to see if the audience has any questions or anything you'd like to ask.
You're dealing specifically over and over again with the horrors of war and the implications that it has, not for the generals, not for the emperor, but for the individuals. And I think the book so well allowed people to understand that the ordinary person gets swept up into this, and it's what you said before about the responsibility for what they did and their inability to actually believe that they did it. And it certainly happened in Germany. And there are very few books that actually allow the commoner to be present. At the same time, there's something called Battalion 101, where he looks into the behavior of these sort of, in quotes, ordinary Germans who become part of a killing squad. How does that happen? What in our nature enables us, allows us, permits us somehow to be willing to kill another human being? And so that question for me was ever present as I read the book. Yeah. And it clearly is for you, using words like trauma and upstander and perpetrator. But the reality is it comes back to moral choice in a very different society. And Susan, maybe you could speak to that in terms of Western standards of what is moral, good and evil, original sin, and then Japan.
I'm actually thinking about my father, who was a professor of German history at Harvard, and his specialty was the composition of the Nazi Party in Bavaria. And among other things, he did hear Hitler speak a couple of times in the 1930s. And I said to him when I was sort of learning about all this, I said, my God, weren't you terrified? I mean, this madman. I thought, oh no, it was obvious. Only idiots would be persuaded by this guy. And I think in recent years we've had a similar kind of awakening in America about, no, don't be so quick to dismiss people's ability to be persuaded. And one thing that was very interesting was, and he never finished his magnum opus. He was working on it for 50 years. I think my mother always said she was going to divorce him because he wasn't finishing. But one reason why is he was so careful, because you could not go around accusing people of having been a Nazi without incredibly good, solid evidence. And after the war, all the Nazis kind of disappeared. Right. So you really, people might say, oh yes, so-and-so's cousin's friend, I know he was a Nazi. But how do you deal with that? Because really you do have this whole society that is complicit and also utterly disgusted. And I will say, I think that over the years, because I've lived in Germany when I was little, and I've been watching how they've dealt with their own war memory and guilt. On the whole, I think they've done a pretty good job with it, and because they have tried to recognize it and engage with it on a really moral basis. And I do think that's something that I'm impressed with. And I think partly was because the scale of the atrocity and the fact that it was known sooner and much more widely. One of the things that came up in your book, and again, A Train to Harbin, it's a story that was most shocking, because I mean, I knew about this unit, this medical unit, and the vivisection experiments. I kind of knew about it, but I didn't really know about it. And then reading this, I thought, my God, this ought to be more well known. It's easy for me to say, but I think you're performing a really moral service here by bringing this up. And I think that's one thing that, over time, I mean, I also feel like, also remembering something from my youth, which is my college career, taking a course on Japanese culture, and one of the speakers was a Professor Howard Hibbett, who became my professor later on. He was talking about World War II, he was talking about 20th century Japanese literature. And he started his talk by saying, the shadow of the war is still very, very deeply present in modern Japanese literature. And I remember writing this down. And this is 1975. Yeah. But I also remember thinking, yeah, well, that won't last very long. My annoying adolescent way of thinking I knew everything. And of course, it's still there. The shadow is still there, and it's still over everything. And your book expresses that so well, and both painfully and beautifully, and how shadows don't disappear, maybe unless we shine light on them. And I think that's what your book is trying to do. And I hope that it will be translated to Japanese. Oh, wow. And very much, and I really think it should be really be a force for good.
Yeah, because I think the other thing too is that, that there is this erasure that's happening too, of history. And I think my grandfather passing was a big moment because he lived through the war. And so that was one thing. And I grew up in Southeast Asia, and I went to British schools, and the focus was very Eurocentric, and so I learned much more about Europe and in America and England than about Asia and Japan. And this was also the time of economic boom in Japan. So Japan was this sort of a dominant economic power, and so I was never really confronted by this history. And even in Japan, in Japan, it's such a big reference point. It's always mentioned. It's always on TV. War is just a thing that people are talking about. But in my family, certainly, you never really hear too much about the individual experiences, at least not around me. And so I think that sort of got me really interested in the collusions, like the ways that society and institutions kind of collude to silence or mute this certain parts of history, and so in a way this was kind of a response to that, so from a personal point of view.
But I'm also afraid, I think it's institutions, but as we were saying before the program started, it's concern that somehow there's just history is being pushed away because it's boring, or it's don't want to talk about it, or got other things to do, there's too much going on in the world. And I'm very worried, of course, because I teach at a university, and I think my students know some history, but now I'm getting worried because, first of all, time is passing, and the internet is huge. There's so many other things to take up your time. So I think it's definitely institutions are doing this, but I also worry that we need to do more on a personal level with our students or our families to kind of make sure that history is not erased on any level.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious about, on a different level, how you came to do your research for this book. So you said you watched documentaries and you were, being very mindful of that, but you also said your parents didn't talk that much about it with you. So were you kind of like mining for gold or reading through diaries, or kind of how did you collect these?
Well, so I think, first, I think when I moved back to Japan in the middle of high school, I started to learn this history, and I was appalled that I had lived all my life in Southeast Asia and didn't even know this history. I lived in countries that were occupied by Japan. And so that was the beginning of that. And then coming here and, realizing that there was relatively little about this history. And, what there was seemed so one-sided and stereotypical, and kind of followed this particular kind of narrative that was triumphalist. And it starts with Pearl Harbor, and, and then it was like this technological feat of dropping these atomic bombs. and then there were all these stereotypes in between, and it was sort of like, you know, it kind of made me concerned about, because the US, you know, the American military is really active in Asia and in Japan. And so it kind of made me concerned. And then I thought, okay, well, how can I respond to this? And so, and my background in, I think, academia probably helped a little bit there, because I started to read critical books, academic books around the topic. And that kind of gave me a way to, it kind of shows you where the fault lines are and where the tensions are and where the issues are. And so it kind of gave me a frame to look at archival and cultural materials. So, you know, like letters, memoirs, diaries, documentaries, things like that. And then also how other people have written about this creatively, or, you know, artistic representation or music, this kind of cultural output, and how they have been responding to this. And then to think about, well, what do I want to do here? You know, how can I contribute to this particular thing? And so digging around that way, you know, and then I kind of had to figure out sort of what was important to me in terms of this. And, you know, I think one thing I realized was that often the larger context gets erased from cultural texts like literature. And so I wanted to kind of put that back in. So it's not just about the war, but putting that war within a larger sort of context and tracing the roots and sort of the ripple effects into the future, because I don't feel like we are done, you know, with the war.
One thing I felt is this is such an individual book. I mean, I was going to ask you, do you have other, you know, inspirations? Obviously, you like Borges, but I can't think of any book like this, really. Is there anything out there that inspired you?
It was hard to find like something, and I think W.G. Sebald writes.
Yes.
You know, there's this kind of interplay between like memory and history and war guilt and responsibility. And also Alexander Hemon wrote this like collection of stories that are also kind of like this. They're loosely put together. It's not really a family or anything, but it's thematically kind of connected in these ways, and it's very formally experimental in different ways, and but not experimental for experience sake, but, you know. And so that's probably, and then I think Svetlana Alexievich, she has this polyphonic sort of thing where it's a blend of interviews that she does, and she kind of makes them into these narratives. And I kind of came too late to her work, you know, for this book, but towards the end when I saw this, it was really helpful.
That's really interesting. I was thinking about landscape, and you have some said Sebald, and I think Svetlana also has the eeriness of landscape or ruins and things. And I had not known about Matsushiro. I can't believe I was studying Japan for 40 years, over 40 years now, and I didn't know that there had been a secret headquarters, you know, outside of Tokyo, where they were going to move the emperor, and that there are these in Nagano, right? Yeah. And all these tunnels and speaking of mazes and forking paths and everything. Right, right. And that was just fascinating. I think that's a whole other thing if you wanted to explore, that you can go into the eeriness of the contemporary, you know, late capitalist, post-war landscape that is just, that's, oh, you do have something about ghosts. Very late in the book, you brought that in. That was an interesting story, that your last story, you bring in a bunch of ghosts who might be seen sitting at a table. I was wondering about that, and if that's anything, was that a kind of a sense of ghosts of history or ghosts of specific incidents or characters? Yeah,
I mean, there's definitely a haunting in this whole book, and into the future too. And I think that that's, you know, partially this, you know, it's kind of like a phantom limb type of situation.
Yeah. And oh, what's her name? The woman who disappears in the second to last story. but may appear
right,
again
right.
as some kind of avatar or some kind of,
Right.
virus or something. That was very, again, the sense of haunting in a technological form.
Yeah, because at that point, this is like maybe 10 years from now, where basically war has gone online largely. I mean, there's wars still, but it's online. And so the frontier has shifted. And so that's sort of like an exploration there, and it's a different kind of haunting there.
If there are no more questions, I think we can finish up and say thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I'm very grateful for having had the
you.
chance to meet you and talk to you and
Yeah.
read this incredible book. It was thrilling to read something that's so good, that's so
thank you
immediate,
so
that's
much.
been just written just this year. So thank you,
so
Asako.
much.
Susan just ended by thanking you for this book that came out this year. Left the impression that it might have only taken a year to write. But my impression from what you had said has been a 12-year journey into a very difficult part of our history and our memory, and how important that is for all of us to acknowledge. 12 years ago, we took our grandson to Japan. It was his request, and we had this program of taking each grandchild alone, just with Sue and I. And he wanted to go to Japan. And the questions that he raised throughout that are questions that are so pertinent exactly to what you have written that I'm definitely making sure he read the book. But one of them was very, very profound when we went to the Peace Museum in Hiroshima. And he walked in and he said, well, what is this all about? Because there's a replica of the bomb that was dropped at the beginning of the museum. And he said, why is this called a Peace Museum? And that question is just one of many that needs to be continually addressed. And it seems to me that, in fact, fiction may be a more effective way to continue to address it than nonfiction. So we're very grateful to both of you for sharing both your questions and the perspectives that Susan brought, and Asako for having written it and shared it with us, and now hopefully to many, many more people who will be able to engage with Inheritors. Thank you all.